Hey everyone, welcome to Neighbor Science, the only podcast about political economy and anime. I'm Ryan Salisbury, and today we have first-time guest Christopher, aka Ice Must Be Destroyed guy. How you doing, Chris?
Hello. I'm doing pretty good. Doing pretty good. It's stunningly a nice day. Sun is out. Having a good time.
Sun's out, guns out.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's just a thing that cool guys say, I guess. Not me. So today we are on part 7, chapter 8 of Seeing Like a State. If you haven't listened to the other parts of the series, you might want to go back and listen to them. I don't think it's like so dependent on the earlier stuff that you won't get anything out of it, but you know, it's a series. You may as well listen to the whole thing. So chapter 8 is called Taming Nature and Agriculture of Legibility and Simplicity. And so this is all about the differences between like indigenous agriculture versus state agriculture. Do you have any preliminary thoughts on this before we get into it?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting, and this ties into sort of the last episode, or last few episodes, but the way that specifically with agriculture, it sort of doesn't matter whether you're dealing with these sort of enormous state-driven industrialization, like agricultural industrialization efforts, or whether you're dealing with the sort of market reform, USAID stuff. Just the way they think about farming is just exactly the same, and they run into exactly the same problems. Yeah, and this whole chapter, I guess, is Scott's going really in depth about the specific, like the polyculture, modern culture stuff, and the specific ways that I guess you call it high modernist, but the ways that sort of scientific forestry and the ways that industrial agriculture intend to impose themselves on a land instead of like working around it, and that how this just doesn't work at all.
Right. I think one thing that's really interesting about this topic is like it's so essential to like our survival. You know, we need to eat every day, and we like most people I think just don't know how any of this stuff works. I read probably more than the average person about agriculture, and I didn't know some of the stuff that was in this chapter at all. And this is really one of those things where people who don't know a lot about it will just like assume that the way that it's done on the mass scale is like the only way that it can be done.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you start talking about permaculture or something like that, then a lot of the like high modernist or like God, I hate that there's still no word for this, but like people who subscribe to scientism, you know what I mean?
Mm.
They will say like there's no way that you can feed, you know, all the humans that are alive right now without doing like mass pesticides and like huge monocultures and stuff like that. But I think we'll get into how I don't think that's really true. And he doesn't quite touch as much on like how the industrial agriculture system is like destroying the planet to the point where like we won't be able to feed everyone by like 2060. Which we talked about on the show like several times, especially with Young Neocon. That's like a big repeat topic for us, but I think we'll see why why it works the way that it does, and I don't know, I guess like why it's not going to work out for the better if we don't do something about it. So Scott is talking about these, like the similarities between the scientific forestry that he talked about in chapter 1 with scientific agriculture. The preconditions of the simplifications done in scientific forestry and presumably in scientific agriculture were the existence of a commodity market and competitive pressure on states as well as entrepreneurs to maximize profits and revenue. So one thing that Young Neocon kept bringing up in the last episode was that like most of the pressures were due to like the Tanzanian government trying to produce farms that would, you know, grow export crops and So in order to do that, you have to succumb to these like higher level organizations of the state and their needs and like their expectations. And so we're going to see like what shapes those, like, and what their mode of thought is behind that.
Yeah, I think there's also something important here that Scott, it's not really what Scott's talking about, but something that shapes the sort of global agricultural market is that, so when all of the sort of the WTOs and NAFTA, when all of the sort of free trade agreements were signed, basically it was made illegal to do sort of state subsidies for in theory, it was made illegal to do state subsidies of things like agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are a couple of exceptions carved out to this. Things like German shoemaking or something. Like there's a couple of like very specific exceptions that you need to do in order to get like the G7 to hold together. But then the one other big exception is that American agriculture gets to have these like billions and billions and billions of dollars of farm subsidies that is literally illegal for any other country to do. And this is one of the other problems of trying to do. This happens before to some extent, like Tanzania's trying to enter the global market, but like this causes a big problem because if you're trying to produce agricultural goods for the market and you have to compete with just these like extremely inefficient but unbelievably subsidized like giant American factory farms, you're kind of screwed.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, again, like just like the U.S. government just funnels money on them, and that makes a lot of the sort of agricultural stuff look a lot more productive than it actually is. Just because they're the only people who are allowed to have all of this sort of like state-backed like agricultural subsidies.
Right. That was actually I don't remember exactly why. I think it was something to do with the ethanol craze in like the late 2000s, but that was one of the first like political economy facts that I learned was that corn only like happens in the US because it's so subsidized by the government. But I definitely didn't know that it was illegal for other countries to do that.
Yeah, well, and this is another interesting thing. I actually talked about this a bit on another podcast, but it's about like the way that American agriculture functions is basically on, cause it's not just the corn, like California agriculture, which isn't as like quote unquote industrialized, it's high labor input.
Mm-hmm.
But that also works on state subsidies. And the other thing it works on is just like hyper exploited migrant labor and the fact that anytime any other non-white group comes in and like actually starts doing the farming well, because again, the white Californians can't farm, like they just get ethnically cleansed. Like this is what Japanese internment was. It was white farmers being like, hold on, wait, we have a chance to just completely wipe out every Japanese farmer in California. And they did it. And, you know, when internment happened, like all of the land the Japanese farmers had taken just got redistributed to like white farmers. And so, yeah, this is the fun, this is the fun stuff, quote unquote, where, you know, like I think Kevin Carson calls it he calls it the subsidy of history, where it's like a lot of agricultural practices, like a lot of capitalist firms get the subsidy that's just like genocide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That like deeply shapes the way that sort of different agricultural and sort of modernist projects work in ways that don't really get talked about much and is incredibly depressing.
I might have mentioned it on this show before. I don't remember exactly, but I was reading about The Wealth of Nations, and Adam Smith in there talks about how the U.S. economy works so well because there's plentiful land that can be cultivated.
Yeah.
But like doesn't mention why that's the case.
Yep.
And I think that's a good summary of, I don't know, economics as a field and U.S. history and and so on. So Scott, in this chapter, he emphasizes that he doesn't want to get too much into the particular reasons that specific projects of scientific agriculture failed, but wants to look at the deeper underlying causes. And he says that these were, in other words, systemic failures and would have occurred under the best assumptions about administrative efficiency and probity. I don't actually remember what failures he was talking about specifically, but anyway, let's just move on. So he says that experimental science is a useful tool for many things, but not for dealing with something like an ecosystem, because you need to isolate specific variables and ignore everything else. And the more things that you ignore, the less it applies to reality when you bring it out of the experimental setting. And he keeps talking about that repeatedly in here, because scientific agriculture is essentially like based on the idea that these experiments in like one small field for one crop cycle can just be applied on the mass scale over unlimited amounts of time, which is, the cause of many of our problems today.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me a lot of the physics joke of assume a cow is a sphere of uniform volume of uniform density.
Oh yeah.
And it's, they're trying to, like, they have all these spherical cows, and they're like, okay, the spherical cow is going to do this. The spherical cow will roll down the hill, and they have a bunch of actual cows, and the cows don't roll down the hill, and they're like, wait, why is this happening? And this just keeps happening over and over again.
So I'm not going to quote the whole thing, but a passage from the beginning of the chapter. Scott says, "My purpose is to show how the imperial pretensions of agronomic science, its inability to recognize or incorporate knowledge created outside its paradigm, sharply limited its utility to many cultivators. Whereas farmers, as we shall see, seem pragmatically alert to knowledge coming from any quarter should it serve their purposes, modern agronomic planners are far less receptive to other ways of knowing." So that's the setup for the rest of the chapter, I suppose. All right, so I'm just going to keep going. That was all the sections in this are short. It's like 36 very short sections for this chapter. So you're going to hear the next section is called very, very often. So the next section is called Varieties of Agricultural Simplification, subsection Early Agriculture. So he's talking about like, I don't think he's talking about like ancient agriculture so much as like the crudest forms of agriculture, because it's hard to know a whole lot about ancient agriculture, and I think that's the topic that he gets into in his later book. But he points out something that I've had to come to realize myself, which is even the most rudimentary forms of cultivation involve lessening biodiversity. So whenever you farm, there's always some amount of trade-off with the natural ecosystem, because the point of it is to increase the population of something favorable to you, and you can't really do that without taking up space that would otherwise be used for other life forms. So here's where he talks about the land races thing. It's a little difficult to understand, but it's basically seems like it's cultivars that are genetically diverse and adapted to certain places and conditions, as opposed to like arbitrary standardized cultivars like we have today, where like a land race would be like a cultivar specific to the Appalachian foothills in a hot and dry season, whereas a modern cultivar would be like slow bolting, drought resistant something. That's just my guess. I don't think he gives like very specific examples on this.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense though.
Yeah, and he says that all modern crops of any economic significance are the product of land races. So basically, like these so-called crude farmers or rudimentary farmers created like millions of different cultivars of plants, and from that, the scientists found ones that were especially conducive to their specific purposes and selected those and turned them into modern hybrid forms. And he says until about 1930, all scientific crop breeding was essentially a process of selection from among the existing land races. And so since then, they've come up with these hybrids. And then this book, again, was written in 1998. So this was before like BT corn really took over everything.
Yeah.
So he doesn't really mention that at all, which was kind of interesting.
Well, I think he talks a bit about like it's interesting because when you can there's evidence he sees it coming to some extent. I mean, especially with the next section about sort of 20th century agriculture, there's there's some signs that he's like, the standardized modern like cultivars like have less genetic diversity, and you get monocropping. And if you project that out, like the logical like extreme example of this is just you have just BT corn, and it's just only BT corn.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is all we have the benefit of 20 more years of absolute bullshit going on in farming. So yeah.
And I think the way that the BT corn works is that they actually take like a regular breed of corn. Like, I mean, it would be yellow dent corn. That's what every single type of corn is in the US. And they just like shoot genes into it. So they can take like an existing corn breed and make it into BT corn.
Mm.
So it's not like a specific like breed of corn. That's just what they turn it into by, I think what they do is they like attach this bacterial DNA to like gold nanospheres and then like shoot it with a gun into the corn.
Interesting.
Like an AR-15. That's what they use.
Wait.
But anyway,
I'm just having this image of someone just like machine gunning as like all those giant World War II Gatling guns, just like gonna get all this corn.
Like the bit in Futurama where Bender finds a Tommy gun and he just like shoots the whole clip out and he's like, that was fun.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah. So that section is just about the land races. Not a lot else in there. And then there's another subsection that Chris just mentioned, which is 20th century agriculture. So he says it's characterized by its lack of genetic diversity, input intensity, and mechanization. And I think he actually was just talking about the hybridization stuff with the lack of genetic diversity, because I never thought of this, but he points out that basically like hybridization. Well, he doesn't say this specifically, but hybridization was like the genetic engineering of its time, and one of the things that people freak out about with the GM crops is the Terminator seeds, as they're supposedly called, which is like a seed that you can only plant once and then you can't like collect seed from it. But he points out that like these hybrids, you can't really collect seed from them either, because either they are sterile and they won't produce any like additional generations of plants,
mm-hmm.
or even if they're not, you won't get the same hybrid out of the seed like that you collect that you got going into it. So it's not even like really a new thing, the so-called Terminator seeds.
Yeah.
And then another thing that I thought was really interesting about this was two proponents of this niche kind of made up subject called phytoengineering are quoted by Scott as saying, machines are not made to harvest crops. In reality, crops must be designed to be harvested by machine. And so he talks about specifically the supermarket tomato, which is the nasty, bad, watery tomato that you get at the grocery store that come in the container of 4 or whatever. And so he says the tomato plants eventually bred for mechanical harvesting were hybrids of low stature and uniform maturity that produce similarly sized fruits with thick walls, firm flesh, and no cracks. The fruits were picked green in order to avoid being bruised by the grasp of the machinery, and were artificially ripened by ethylene gas during transport. The results were the small, uniform winter tomatoes sold 4 to a package, which dominated supermarket shelves for several decades. Taste and nutritional quality were secondary to machine compatibility.
Something that's made me think about this. It's kind of far afield, but I guess it fits into the sort of the theme of modernism. Is so this whole thing about how you have the machine, right, and you have to sort of fit everything else around it to make the machine work.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's like 2 interesting examples. There's one was like David Graeber talks about this, about how like early computers just like sucked.
Yeah,
like sort of like in like the 70s and 80s, it was like it's like all the banking systems using computers was like they're bad. They don't do their job. They break all the time, and there's this whole process of having to make everyone else like in the society function around how badly these machines work. And this actually still happens.
Yeah.
Like a lot of like mechanized stuff in factories doesn't, like, it's all fake. Like it just doesn't work. So people have to constantly sort of like hack stuff together in order to get like these like incredibly advanced machines to work. And then the other one, so there's something happens in like the very early Chinese Revolution This is like 1940, like maybe like even 1948, 1949, where like the only sort of industrialized stuff that's left in World War II are this like factory built in Manchuria that was built by the Japanese. Sorry, I'm going like really far afield here.
It's fine.
But this I swear this goes back to this. But yeah, you know, and there's an early attempt to like run these factories democratically, and they can't do it because the factories were just like physically designed to use slave labor. And so the only way they can get these factories to work is by sort of reinstalling the managerial system. And I keep thinking about the ways that both, and this is the sort of the flip side of it. You have two sides of these sort of technical systems where on the one side you have these factories that like require certain, like literally physically require certain forms of human social organization in order to function. And then the flip side is that you have these machines where in order to get like the plant, like, you know, the harvesters to work, right, you have to completely redesign the natural environment, and going all the way from, you know, plowing fields flat and getting rid of marshes all the way down to we have to like genetically engineer these tomatoes so that they're exactly the right sort of
height and all that stuff.
They have all this uniformity, and I don't know, it strikes me as interesting. Like this is just the broad social consequence of having all of these sort of incredibly top down, like high modernist engineering projects. Is you have to engineer in order for them to work. Both the physical environment and all of the people using it have to be engineered specifically to their purposes, and this has just disastrous effects for everyone.
I want to get really into that specific point about the factories at some point, because I've tried to explain that to people before, where I'm like, yeah, I mean, if there is like a revolution and we abolish the state, we're also going to have to like dismantle those factories and recycle their materials for something else. And people are always like, well, why don't we just use them? And it's like, well, because they're made for like slaves, essentially. Like, yeah, they're not like more efficient. I did a whole episode on like how factories emerged. They aren't built because they're more efficient. They're built because it facilitates surveillance and forced labor. And that's the whole point of them. So like, why would you want to do that, but like voluntarily? Yeah, it makes no sense. And I didn't think of connecting it to this specific subject. So that was an interesting point.
Yeah, it does come back to this. Like in the last chapters, he doesn't do it as much here, but Scott talks a lot about the ways that, you know, the giant sort of factory farms, giant collectivized farms are designed to mimic a factory, and that it gives you the same level of state control.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think you know that the mirroring, the attempt to transform every aspect of production, every aspect of social life, every aspect of sort of human interactions into something that is legible to a state is really important in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll talk about them. I will talk about the other thing later. Yeah.
And then the other thing I wanted to say, Chris and I did an episode, co-host Chris and I did an episode on the Soviet tea industry in Georgia. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about that was like, you know, tea grows on trees. So they're like trees. But the way that they grew it in Soviet Georgia it was like a long like mound. And the reason they did this is because they had these machine harvesters that would basically come and like give them a haircut.
Oh no.
So instead of like having laborers come in and like pick 2 leaves in a bud, like, you know, they do in China, they would just come and like shave off all the leaves and stems and twigs so that they could have like this extremely large scale production. And I mean, it was obviously like terrible tea, but they did produce all of their own tea. So mission accomplished, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess tea is just not made to be machine harvested the way that like, you know, wheat is or something. Mm-hmm. That whole section was basically about that. Oh yeah, I did want to make the point that like I'm an engineer, a sort of engineer. And so I know that making a machine do something, like the difficulty of doing that increases exponentially if the task isn't like uniform. Mm-hmm. So tomatoes being uniform heights, like I really get that. Like, and the complexity thing goes doubly so if you're talking about physical moving parts rather than just like software or electronics. So like a machine that could harvest crops even remotely resembling the way that human hands could would be like, if not impossible, sci-fi technology, prohibitively expensive compared to like just forcing people to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why there's still like tons of farm labor jobs where they basically like force migrants to do it. Basically, like actually existing mechanization has to use something close to the ideal of a flat field with identical plants growing uniform fruits of perfectly even maturity. So like, they really have to like shape the plant and the environment to make it work with the machine, because otherwise the machine would be too expensive to be like usable by farmers.
This is reminding me again of the thing Scott brings up over and over again about how, you know, like the Soviet collective farm designed in a hotel room in Chicago.
Yeah, that is so funny.
Yeah, but when you're doing machines like this, you inevitably like have to do something like this because of the sort of the demands of this kind of agriculture.
Right. And another thing that he like mentions in passing is I don't know how many people are familiar with like models of engineering design, but like basically in the 60s and 70s, all these engineers would have used the waterfall model, which is where you like lay out this huge like tome of requirements for every single thing and like try to design like every single aspect of whatever you're engineering like at the beginning, and then you just like implement it in one go. Whereas today it's more like an iterative process of like you design part of it and then test it and then see what works and change what doesn't work, and then you design another part of it and so on until you have like a full machine. But so like their failures in design were like amplified by the fact that they just like did it all in one go and like didn't go back and revise anything afterwards.
Yeah.
And so speaking of that, the next subsection is called the unintended consequences of simplification. So there was a research council, a U.S. National Research Council committee formed after this corn leaf blight destroyed much of the U.S. harvest in 1970. And they studied crop epidemics from the Irish potato famine up to 1970. And they concluded these encounters show clearly that crop monoculture and genetic uniformity invite epidemics. All that is needed is the arrival on the scene of a parasite that can take advantage of tube vulnerability. If the crop is uniformly vulnerable, so much the better for the parasite. In this way, virus diseases have devastated sugar beets with yellows, peaches with yellows, potatoes with leaf roll and X and Y viruses, cocoa with swollen shoot, clover with sudden death, sugarcane with mosaic, and rice with hoja blanca. And then Scott goes on to say that the modern usage of pesticides, which exploded in the post-war period and has culminated in GMO crops to be resistant to them, must be seen as an integral feature of this genetic vulnerability, not as an unrelated scientific breakthrough. That just makes me think of how like scientists have been warning for like decades that society is also at risk of a massive pandemic that would completely take it out.
Yeah.
And it turns out they were right about that.
And I think it's also interesting that, you know, this is an example of just like the problems that they're trying to deal with the sort of pesticide increases, right? You know, this is the whole pesticide treadmill thing. Like they're causing the problem that the pesticide is designed to deal with is a problem they have caused,
right?
And they are trying to solve it with more pesticides. But it's like, okay, you are the one who caused this problem with the sort of monocultures in the first place, and you know you can have whatever unbelievably lethal pesticides that, like, God help you if there's ever any production problem here, you know, you're gonna get appalled. Like,
come on, man, what are we gonna run out of nitrogen?
Yeah, well, you know, they keep doing this, but they never address the underlying issue of like of the way they're doing agriculture in the first place, and so they're just stuck throwing more intense poisons.
It's my favorite phrase. The problems are bad, but the causes are very good.
Yeah.
One thing that was just like so salient to this is the solution to the 1970s blight that spurred that study ended up coming from a rare Mexican landrace that was then hybridized with the 4 varieties. Oh, it's actually 7 varieties of corn grown across the entire U.S. I looked it up yesterday. 7 varieties of corn in the entire U.S. So thus the planned forest/village/city/society/farm failed and had to be rescued by an informal and unplanned forest/village/city/society/farm, which was deprecated by the state for, being the way that it is, which makes it like better than the thing that failed.
I have a sort of funny story about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
My aunt married an indigenous dude, so I have a bunch of family who like live on a res in like Montana. And one of the things that he does is he spends a bunch of time growing like different kinds of corn. And so, we get like
like he fucks around with new types.
Yeah. Well, and also like he specifically like he's dealing with sort of he's trying to sort of bring back to some extent the practices around older practices around cold cultivation from sort of around the Americas. And
cool. Yeah,
it's extremely cool. And he has the coolest dog. His dog just like chases bears off. It rules. Yeah, okay. This is the bear dog interlude. Yeah, but but this is like you were saying about how the state gets bailed out by the people, the sort of like the people whose agricultural methods they sneer at and destroy, just keep being saved by them because maybe one of these actually works better than the other.
Yeah, it's funny like that happens with like so many solutions of like like the wonders of modern science. Like the one that I thought of right away was penicillin. Has been known in some form since like 800 BC. People were like putting moldy bread on their wounds to disinfect them. But then it was like isolated in, was it 1918, 1920, something like that. And they're like, oh my God, wow, science invented penicillin. That's crazy.
Yeah, well, funny thing is they didn't even like they did it on accident. Like they didn't even figure it out. Like they screw up. They didn't even get there.
All right, so the next section is the Catechism of High Modernist Agriculture. I still don't know what catechism means. Why don't you define that while I read ahead and figure out what to say?
Oh God. Okay, so this is we're tapping into my deep Lutheran knowledge from when I was a child and went to confirmation. So catechisms are like, oh God. So the Luther is like there's a small catechism and a big catechism. It's just like this sort of like it's basically a statement of faith.
Okay.
That's like written out, and whenever you have a theological question in Lutheranism, it's like what is the Trinity, blah 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 blah, and you don't want to commit heresy. You say the Catechism word for word because that's the only thing you can say about it. That's not heresy.
Okay.
So yeah, this is what a catechism is.
My girlfriend and I just watched the new season of Solar Opposites, which is like kind of a dumb, like it's basically Rick and Morty but with aliens.
Yeah.
With aliens as main characters. Rick and Morty already has aliens. But anyway, one of the episodes they have like they get into like the culture of the planet that they came from, and one of the things was like the sacred number, and they like recite it before they eat. And so I guess that's what they're referring to, the catechism.
Yeah.
Okay. That explains it to me. So Scott is talking about the like export model of agriculture, which became the dominant system in the US in the post-war era. And he says that hundreds of irrigation and dam projects modeled roughly on the Tennessee Valley Authority were begun, and that U.S. advisors went around the world to assist with creating highly capitalized, large-scale mechanized agriculture. And that actually many of the personnel they sent around were from the Department of Agriculture, the DOT, the FAO, the USAID, and often the Tennessee Valley Authority itself. So the reason that like a lot of agriculture around the world mirrors the U.S. is because it was literally like U.S. Tennessee Valley Authority or Department of Agriculture officials like telling them how to do it. So he talks about Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, which was like supposedly started the environmental movement. I think that's probably an overstatement, but that's what everyone says about it. So he says like at that time, like most scientific writers were saying like the exact opposite of what Rachel Carson was saying, which is like mechanized agriculture is bad, DDT is bad, like all this stuff. They were instead saying like, no, we need fields that are like 100 yards across and miles long so they can be harvested by one big machine pass. And the grain needs to be put into an elevator straight into a silo and animal feed lot, which is like right next door. And we're going to have weather control to prevent hailstorms and tornadoes. And atomic energy will level hills and make irrigation water from seawater. Just like completely insane stuff to us, but at the time maybe like it was more plausible. But
I think there's something interesting. I'm talking about China because I spent a lot of time studying Chinese agriculture, sort of accidentally. But there's an interesting thing here where even when they don't have the machines, like the sort of high modernists think like this. Like in China, like their big agricultural problem is that they don't like they actually do need to produce a grain surplus because they have this urban population, but they don't have any. Like basically no mechanized stuff,
right?
But even this is where the sort of Chinese collapse differs from the Soviet one is that they like so their solution to this is we're just going to throw people at it, but they still do this same thing. Where like in the first 10 years, but before the Great Leap Forward, Chinese agriculture was like it was doing fine. Its productivity was actually increasing.
Yeah, I was going to say, wasn't the whole thing of the Great Leap Forward was like they took people out of the country and put them in the cities? Like,
well, I mean, they did a couple things. One of the big, so they took a bunch of agricultural labor out of the fields and made them do like dig trenches and stuff, like canals and all these irrigation products, and the way they counterbalanced was just make everyone in the fields work harder. But then also for no reason, and the only reason you can think of this for this is purely ideological, is that they took control of farming outside of the hands of like the people who were doing the farming, which is how it had worked until then, and just like expanded it to the commune level, which is like these massive. Suddenly, you have like thousands and thousands of people in these communes that are spread out over huge geographic areas. People don't even know each other, and they want these massive organizational units. And there's no reason for this. It doesn't work. It's significantly less effective. And like they start combining people's plots, so you get these like miles long plots. But it's like they don't even have like the tractors for it. They're just doing this out of like
Marxist aesthetic, basically.
Yeah, like pure Zizek, like the pure Zizek ideology. Like it's incredible.
Oh, God damn it! I put a really good joke in here. So this guy Billard was talking about this, atomic energy leveling hills and stuff. And I said, or as Billard says later in the article, capitalism is American power plus electrification of the countryside. That's the best joke in this fucking note stock, and I missed it.
It's a good joke.
So, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the nerds of this time didn't believe in iterative improvement like the nerds of today, so they preferred big honkin' planned projects built from scratch. So the purely technical projects they planned out were seen as exercises in technical expertise and the creation of modules that could be used anywhere, which any programmer will know why that doesn't work.
Yeah, well, and I want to talk about that briefly as my last digression for a bit. So
Sure.
So I studied anthropology in college, and
lucky.
This book is one of the things you have to read, and there's a lot of anthropologists who don't like it for a number of reasons. But there's a really interesting critique of it called "Seeing Like an Oil Company" by James Ferguson that I think everyone should read because it's like 5 pages long. But it's about how, contra the way that sort of at the very beginning of the book, Scott talks about how markets work, and it's like, well, markets have the same sort of unifying, have the same sort of simplification effects that states do, where they try to reduce everything to a legible grid. Ferguson's argument about oil companies is that they do this module thing, but they only do it in like a very, very narrow area. So, if you look at an oil well in Nigeria, right? There'll just be like this town that's just the oil well, where like all of the sort of the like American workers who they brought in to work in the oil well come in, and they have the technical module. It's like exactly like that just like that tiny, very enclosed area is just like basically a piece of the US. Mm-hmm. And then everywhere else around it, they just like the oil company doesn't care about,
right? Because
it only sees these nodes, and then they move from node to node to node, and just ignores the rest of the sort of countryside. And I think that's an interesting difference in the way that states and markets function. that I think but it's interesting because, he is talking about this here, right? This sort of, like Scott is talking about how these sort of modules you can move everywhere. And this doesn't work with agriculture, but it kind of works with oil in ways that allow, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess because for oil, it's only like, you have a substance under the ground and you got to take it out of the ground and that's it.
Yeah.
They're not worried about like destroying any ecosystems. Yeah. That doesn't threaten their productivity at any point.
Well, in fact, like that's the whole point of it, right? Is to destroy the ecosystem. Unlike farming, where you have to, you need the ecosystem to help you do the thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's probably why it works. And then like any other like social consequences, you can basically like throw energy at it,
Yeah. Well, and also, this is sort of getting ahead of this, but one of the things Scott talks about is Hickinson income, which is income that just it keeps going and going and going. Like,
right.
Yeah. And, with oil wells, you're never going to get it and you're not supposed to, right? Like eventually at some point the well's going to be tapped out and you move.
Yeah.
Whereas with agriculture, the goal of it is to generate Hixian income. Yeah. It's, you need to perpetuate so you can keep eating and your children can keep eating, et cetera.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you have to do that, you actually have to like take the local sort of context into account in a way you don't with just oil wells.
Although there is one more advantage to oil, which is that like our like civilization completely depends on it for like every single aspect of it. But especially like preventing people from like rising up and killing the ruling class.
Yeah.
And so like as the oil starts to run out, like they can totally just raise the price and like they will sell every drop of oil that they take out of the ground. No problem.
There's a really good book about this called Carbon Democracy by Timothy Mitchell, which talks about also oil basically as a technique of social control. Because this is sorry. I said this was my last tangent. Another one, but okay, this is a very, very, very short tangent. Basically, like coal miners could essentially just shut down because of the way that moving coal around works and how difficult it is to get out of the ground. Like a coal miner strike can just shut down a country.
Yeah,
but with oil strikes, actually strikes are actually good for oil companies because any the problem with oil is there's too much of it. And you have to like do monopolistic things to like decrease the amount of it. It's more complicated than this, but like, if something happens that actually decreases, like legitimately, genuinely decreases the supply of oil, that's like the best thing that can possibly happen.
Like the Iraq War.
Yeah, for an oil company, and the capitalist power people talk about this with the sort of petrodollar coalition, where you have this coalition to start wars in order to raise oil prices for various reasons, but. But it's an incredibly effective tool of social control. And yeah, read Carbon Democracy so I don't do this entire thing here and rant for 30 minutes about it. Yeah, great book.
Yeah, I've been writing the books down. I will put them in the show description so people can look them up.
Sweet.
Okay, so back to the book. The next section is called Monoculture and Polyculture. And Scott says there is no better illustration of the myopic credo of high modernist agriculture than its nearly unshakable faith in the superiority of monoculture over the practice of polyculture found in much of the third world. That's one of those sentences I just really liked. There's been a lot of those in this book.
Yeah.
I'm not usually like a quote guy. Like I don't like quoting people, but the way he writes some of these is just really good. So yeah, he gets into some detail about polycropping, and he says intercropping is especially effective in low fertility soils. And he doesn't mention this, but there is a particular reason that soils in the Americas were really fertile in the 20th century that doesn't apply to other parts of the world, which is how like our intensive agriculture situation came about. I'm talking about like killing the indigenous people who were taking care of the soil and making it good.
Yep.
Yeah, and I actually didn't put this anywhere in the notes, but like the whole thing of this is like the like underlying thing that makes intensive agriculture work is like it's basically a fossil resource.
Yeah,
because we have like millions of years of like natural buildup of humus, and then like thousands of years of indigenous people with their indigenous farming practices, like creating a healthy soil ecosystem and one that's like amenable to repeated planting. And we just like take that and like suck it dry of nutrients in order to grow like huge, massive fields of yellow dent corn.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, co-host Chris and I did an episode on guano, which most people know it as like bat shit, but it's actually mostly seabird shit. And before the Haber-Bosch process was able to fixate nitrogen from the air and create like artificial nitrogen fertilizers, intensive agriculture was built on mining this like millions of years of seabird shit deposits around the coast of South America. And so that was like another like straight fossil resource that was almost depleted and would have been if not for the Haber-Bosch process being created. And we're doing the same thing with phosphorus right now. Most phosphorus comes from mineral sources and is being depleted rapidly.
Yeah, and unlike nitrogen, you can't pull phosphorus out of the air. Actually, it would be extremely funny if we somehow found a way to like mine phosphorus out of our own smog, but I don't think that's happening anytime soon.
You probably need like a tornado force like thing that sucks up air and like spits out tiny amounts of phosphorus. Okay, so yeah, he gets into like some of the basics of polycropping, which like you just read like an article on permaculture and you'll get the same basic understanding of it. We're assuming that you have read that article. So here's the time to read the article. 3, 2, 1. Okay. So even if polycropping didn't increase yields, which it does, there is an important reason that it would be used by non-state farmers anyway that Scott gets into here, which is that it increases food security because of the diversity of crops, characteristics, and disease resistances. So like, even if you plant like only potatoes, if you plant like a dozen different varieties of potatoes, then it's pretty likely that a deadly disease that comes in and kills all of one kind of potato won't like absolutely destroy your harvest and like make you starve. Which is why these indigenous farmers were planting like all these different crops. But there's even other reasons for that. Like different crops maturing at different times means that an individual crop failure will do relatively little damage, and that you don't have like this labor bottleneck like with these large monoculture farms, which have to be harvested all by machine because like they wouldn't have enough labor otherwise.
Yeah, and this is also one of the reasons why you have like just the unbelievable intense violence inflicted on immigrants in this country is that like any disruption to like any sort of organized migrant labor strikes that happen in California are just completely devastating because they're incredibly labor intensive and they also are like highly skilled labor, and if those people stop working, like all of that stuff just rots.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and this is in some sense this is the sort of mirror image of like on the one hand, like you gain you gain a lot of power and social control from having all of your stuff happening at one time, but on the other hand, like it does actually make you weak to sort of in specific ways. Like having these labor bottlenecks makes you weak to sort of or organize the power of organized labor, and then also in this case specifically the power of organized labor of people who are extremely highly skilled and who haven't who capitalism literally cannot de-skill, because without it the whole thing will collapse.
Yeah, if you've never seen it, go look up some videos of these workers like picking vegetables and fruits and putting them into bags. They're like insanely skilled at it.
It's incredible.
And it's like, I mean, it's like pretty sad to look at because they're obviously like destroying their bodies doing this.
Yeah.
And they don't make very much money doing it.
Yeah, shout out to another book here. If you ever just want to be incredibly depressed or you want to learn more about this, there's an ethnography of field workers in California called Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies. That's a lot about this, like just the physical effects of this, and it's horrific. Yeah. This is the Christopher Plugs books.
This is still only like 1/8 of a Young Neocon show.
This is true,
including the tangents. Like he'll go on like a 20-minute tangent, and then I'll be like, "All right, man, we need to get back to the topic." And he's like, "No, I swear to God, this connects." And then like 1 minute later, he connects it, and I'm like, "Oh, okay, cool."
It's funny. He thinks very similar to me, but he like thinks more.
Yeah.
And so you get it's just longer, and there is more of it.
Okay. So yeah. So more reasons that polycropping is good for farmers is farmers live in families, and so like different parts of the family, or different parts of larger groups than that even. Might take care of different crops. And so Scott says the planting regimen, in other words, is a reflection of social relations, ritual needs, and culinary tastes. It is not just a production strategy that a profit-maximizing entrepreneur took straight out of the pages of a text in neoclassical economics. Especially because neoclassical economics models usually assume that you can't consume your own output. So
yeah, it's great.
Yeah, plus they're immortal, so what do they need food for?
Well, they're also gods. Like,
yeah,
they're all knowing. It's great.
They know everything. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, incredible stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if they have a crop failure, I don't know why don't they just get into a different industry entirely, like an instant? That's what we assume they do.
Wait, what do you mean these people are dying? That's against their self-interest.
Just work on Wall Street. There's plenty of money there. So. Yeah, one thing that I thought was interesting that Scott points out is like there's all these advantages to polycropping that make it like very obviously like at least something that should be investigated. Like maybe we should look into it because there are obviously significant advantages to it, and it's like the way that people were farming for thousands of years before the 1900s.
Yeah,
but they don't really do that, and so he says it shows the power of both imperialist ideology and of the visual aesthetic of agricultural high modernism.
Oh, hey, we have this production method that's immensely more efficient than monocropping, but trees know in straight line. So we're just going to distribute it.
Yeah. I was going to skip over this, but I'll just mention it briefly. He talks about Albert Howard, who was a British botanist in India who studied indigenous agriculture there and turned into what is now known as organic farming. And he developed a modern understanding of composting. And so Scott says his concern was chiefly with overall soil health rather than the productivity of individual harvests, which reminds me of the chicken experiment that I mentioned in the last episode, where they like pick the individually most productive chickens, which are the ones that just kill the other chickens and take their eggs. So that's basically like what industrial agriculture is. The plants that kill other plants and take their shit. Wow, that metaphor works like way better than I thought it would.
Yeah.
And so this is where he mentions the Hixian income. He says polyculture is more likely to produce what economists call Hixian income, which is income that does not undermine factor endowments, which is like basically a way of saying like shit that you didn't make yourself, which will permit that income flow to continue indefinitely into the future.
Yeah.
Oh, and I didn't realize that because he didn't mention it before, but he mentions the German forest, but also apparently Japan has like very similar monoculture forests that they created that have led to severe ecological problems. And
yeah,
they actually like almost killed the golden eagle, and they're trying to bring it back with restoration ecology now. Silly Japanese. Should have watched more Miyazaki movies. He tells you all about ecology. The hell, man. All right. So the next subsection is about shifting cultivation. I was planning to skip this because it's the next three, actually, because they're very, very short.
Yeah.
Do you have anything you wanted to talk about in any of those three?
If people move around, it's hard for states to track them, and this pisses people off.
Yeah.
This is another reason why states hate polycropping, because the people who do it move a lot.
One interesting fun fact was that a study on Filipino farmers found that a newly cleared plot of slash and burn farming had an average of 40 to 60 different cultivars planted in it, which is like more than I even thought.
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah. Pretty cool. Yeah. The one after that is fertilizer versus fertility. Is basically just talking about like, using fertilizers in intensive agriculture versus like creating overall soil health. And then the one after that is a history of unauthorized innovation, which is just about how most crop innovation came from indigenous farmers and was just like selected by scientists.
Mm-hmm.
And those farms can be seen as like a laboratory to experiment in a way that actually works instead of like, a what's it called? Experimental field, whatever they call it.
Yeah.
So the next big section is the institutional affinities of high modernist agriculture. And so he's been talking about how like imperial knowledge and modernist aesthetic. But he says there's like more reasons for things to work this way. So I'm just going to quote him directly here. To the degree that to the degree that the cultivator's practices were presumed reasonable until proven otherwise, to the degree that specialists might learn as much from the farmer as vice versa, and to the degree that specialists had to negotiate with farmers as political equals, would the basic premise behind the official's institutional status and power be undermined. The unspoken logic behind most of the state projects of agricultural modernization was one of consolidating the power of central institutions and diminishing the autonomy of cultivators and their communities vis-a-vis those institutions. Every new material practice altered in some way the existing distribution of power, wealth, and status, and the agricultural specialists' claims to be neutral technicians with no institutional stake in the outcome can hardly be accepted at face value. So basically, like, they can't put themselves out of a job by admitting that like there's no point in their existence, is what he's saying.
Well, and I'd also say about this, like, especially when it comes to the sort of neutral, the myth of the neutral technical person with no institutional outcome at stake. Like, there's a reason that like some unbelievable percentage of the senior members of the CCP used to be like came out of engineering technical schools. Like those people are not neutral, are not politically neutral in either of their roles.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this also like this starts to get into the de-skilling topic, because basically like the whole point is the specialists will be doing all of the thinking and just sort of direct, unskilled laborers to do their bidding essentially.
Yeah. And
the whole point is to centralize power.
There's an interesting story about this in this is in endnotes. They talk about a series of battles that happened. This is like early 1900s Germany. Mm-hmm. This is like pre-World War One. There's this huge fight over essentially shop floor control between, I think it's like a knife manufacturing plant, but this happens all over Germany, about whether sort of whether production was going to be managed by like the actual production workers, whether they're going to be able to sort of maintain their skilled labor status, or whether it was going to be just run by the factory director and they were going to sort of lose all of their skills. And the Social Democratic Party like backs the capitalists, like backs the sort of faction that's talking about how well we can improve efficiency if we de-skill all these people. And this has, and they do this under the sort of the guise of this sort of Marxist development of production thing. And this has just absolutely disastrous consequences for just the entire world working class gets screwed by this, because these sort of highly skilled workers, they both tend to be more radical than sort of the people who've been de-skilled and people who've been in the factory system for a long time. And they're also they're more politically powerful. And when the SPD like destroyed them, this is one of the reasons why there's no revolution in Germany, and you get like the Nazis instead. Mm-hmm. And and you see this. This is one of the things that the world, when we talk about the Green Revolution, right, and the whole we need a Green Revolution to stop a Red Revolution. Like this is part of what they're thinking about, because if you can, if you can do this sort of descaling stuff, you're not going to get the kind of sort of peasant revolutions that have been happening for, the whole 20th century. And it's also interesting that, like the communists do this too, because they also don't want peasant revolution.
Yeah.
Highly skilled laborers who run production themselves.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that like the prevailing communist rhetoric is we need a proletarian revolution, but like the vast majority of revolutions in history have been like mostly composed of peasants.
Yeah, and it's worse than that, because it's not just peasants; it's peasants and then factory workers who are like the first gen out of the factory, or coal workers basically, and then the dock workers too for sort of some different reasons.
Yeah.
But those are the people who, like, immediately, whenever a communist revolution happens, it's like we're going after the dock workers. We're transitioning to oil, and we're going to just absolutely obliterate the peasantry. And it works to some extent. Like they were able to hold on to power, but
right. Yeah, I mean, like the more unskilled your workers, the more easily they can be replaced, which not only like drives wages down, but also, if they think of striking, you can easily just fire them.
Yep.
Whereas if you have workers that like you can't just replace them, if they strike, then they will like cripple you.
Yeah.
And then like on the other side of it, there's also descaling with like non-work activities. Like I always think about how my girlfriend had had several students who like she was talking about making coffee at home, and they like didn't understand what she was talking about. They didn't understand that you could make coffee at home very easily.
Oh no.
And thought it was like this really difficult thing to do that only like Starbucks workers could do or something like that.
Jesus.
And I mean like the one pot or one cup coffee systems are like the same way. Like it's not really doing anything for you. It's just like a pre-measured amount of coffee.
Yeah.
And it squirts hot water through it, which like you could just scoop a coffee into your fucking coffee machine and put water in it. It's not hard.
Yeah.
But like by descaling people in terms of like the things that they can make for themselves, you're able to charge them more money for the same thing.
Well, and I think this also goes back to the sort of the whole neoclassical thing where people can't consume their own products, right? Mm-hmm. Because any sort of
that's not a belief; it's a wish list.
Yeah, I mean, and to some extent, it's always something that like can't work because like this is one of the things, like one of the big bases of the Chinese economy, for example, is that so basically the Chinese government just doesn't pay insurance for its like 300 million migrant workers.
Oh, that's good.
And yeah, it's great. It's and Chuang like sort of calculated this. Like basically calculated like if Chinese companies had to actually pay out their insurance, 50% of them would go bankrupt immediately.
Wow.
Now, and the way they can get away with this, well, one is because they murdered the labor movement, and the second way is that so those migrant workers, their sort of their residential status is still technically in their villages where they came from, and they can sort of draw income off of it, and they have this sort of like kind of non-capitalist, but like they have the ability to produce for themselves to supplement their own wages, and this acts as the sort of like non-capitalist subsidy to like in the same way that like this is what it was. It's what a welfare, right? It's the reason that like Walmart when you like sign up for a job for them, like the part of the job training is applying for SNAP, right? It's the sort of the state subsidy that allows you to lower wages more. Except this is it's based off of sort of the remains of sort of socialist period like collective farms.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, but but eventually, and this is like part of the anti-poverty efforts is eventually China wants to destroy that whole thing, right? Is you need to turn everyone into a wage worker, et cetera, et cetera. And so even in the instances where they're temporarily surviving on the fact that people have their own skills and people can sort of consume their own products, like eventually that needs to be destroyed,
right?
And you can see these sort of tensions working themselves out in the Chinese economy, and you see versions of this like around the world.
Yeah, in The Invention of Capitalism by Michael Perelman, he talks a lot about how political economists around the 19th and early 20th century were like kind of obsessed with the appropriate amount of land that people should cultivate to grow food for themselves, because you don't want them growing too much because then they'll be independent.
Yeah.
But you don't want them growing too little because then you would have to like pay them more money so they could like buy food.
Yeah.
And so they settled on like a quarter to a half an acre, basically.
But the other thing I was thinking about this with is the way that, like, well, partially, this is another extremely long tangent, but the way that, like, because like a lot of, like, in New York, for example, used to be fed by just like, there were just a bunch of fish in the ocean, right? And you could catch them and you could eat them, and then we poisoned all of them. And you see this sort of just all out war on, and this, like, even in the 30s, like, a lot of people survived because they had these small vegetable plots. They had these they could hunt animals. And we've just destroyed all that. And, the biggest example of this obviously was like when we killed all the bison.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
As, basically a counterinsurgency technique to do genocide against indigenous people is, you get this sort of capitalist war on nature as a way of essentially de-skilling people and forcing them into the sort of wage labor process.
Yeah, I did like a sidetrack episode like 2-3 episodes ago. And it was about how there used to be like an open commons like in most of the US, and it was basically destroyed as like a revanchist project by former slave owners once their slaves were emancipated, because the slaves were very good at surviving off of the commons. They would graze animals and trap animals and go fishing and stuff, and they had this like decades long effort to create game laws and I forget what the other thing is called, but like basically laws that prevent you from grazing animals at all or without a permit or whatever. Stock laws, that's what it's called.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next section is called the Simplifying Assumptions of Agricultural Science. And so Scott in this section raises the question of why technical studies show much more promise than the actual results bear out. And related to this, why are most of the successful changes to agriculture pioneered by cultivators rather than by the state? So he talks about like isolating variables, which he makes a point to say like it's not bad to like in the complete abstract to like isolate a variable and test it, but it doesn't work the way that it's done here, because for one, agricultural experiments focus on crop by crop tests to discover the impacts of variation on yields. So they're looking at a like single type of crop in a small, tiny experimental field, and they usually only look at over like one season, or maybe two, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And then they just say like, yeah, this will work if you extrapolate it to, hundreds of millions of acres, no problem. So he gets into some detail about this through the various subsections. Oh, I thought this was interesting because I don't know much about physics at all, but he explains that like even in a Newtonian physical system where there's like known exact formulas to predict trajectories of stuff, it's easy to do that with like one body, like one object. But then when like as you go up in the number of bodies, like a 10-body problem has no non-unique orbits, and predicting the long-term state is almost impossible.
Yeah, so I'm gonna butcher some of this because my knowledge of this is secondhand, but like my dad's an astronomer, and I mean like even 3 bodies is like basically impossible to calculate. And yeah, once you get to like 10, it's a disaster. Astronomy is famous for doing the sort of they have the most intense version of the just assume like the spherical cow, where like they'll just round like pi up to 10, like factors of 100 or just whatever, it's fine. Like they have all of these problems they have to do because they essentially have to do all of these sort of broad generalizations because there's literally mathematically no good way to describe what you're dealing with.
Yeah. That's so funny because I thought the opposite. I thought like it was relatively simple to calculate that sort of thing for like 10 bodies. I didn't think that was a big deal.
Yeah, it gets really bad really quickly.
Okay, so Scott already mentioned Rachel Carson, but he didn't talk about DDT in any detail prior to this section. So he's using DDT as an example of a change whose intended effects, even if they work, lead to like unintended catastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
So the proof of DDT came from like these experimental plots where they just tested in like this small crop field, and the negative effects, the proof of the negative effects came from outside the scientific community. So the public awareness first came in the form of noticing the decline of songbird populations. So people noticed it wasn't as noisy outside, and that's because DDT was like devastating not only like their food sources, but also like it was bioaccumulating in the birds themselves and like making it harder for them to reproduce. So this led to a number of other discoveries that eventually caused DDT to be banned, which, you know, all done. Problem solved. Good job, everyone. And so here he starts getting into externalities. He's quoting a rogue economist testifying to Congress in 1972, I think, about DDT. And he says, only in the past decade has serious attention been given to the fact that the large agricultural firm is able to achieve benefits by externalizing certain costs. The disadvantages of large-scale operation fall largely outside the decision-making framework of a large farm firm. Problems of waste disposal, pollution control, added burdens on public service, deterioration of rural social structures, impairment of the tax base, and the political consequences of a concentration of economic power have typically not been considered as costs of large scale by the firm. They are unquestionably larger costs to the larger community. Yeah, so in theory, large-scale operations should enable the firm to bring a wide range of both costs and benefits within its internal decision-making framework. In practice, the economic and political power that accompanies large-scale provides constant temptation to the large firm to take the benefits and pass on the costs. So I wrote a whole aside here. I probably won't read all of it, but you can check it out if you want to. But basically, like, I've thought this many times, but I've never like put it on the record anywhere. I think it's very safe to say that under a class system, benefits go to those who least need them and are most able to claim them, while costs tend to go to those who are the most harmed by them and are least able to resist them. So in other words, like, wealth moves toward the top and ill moves towards the bottom. And that's really what externalities are, is like people with lots of political power being able to just pass on the negative effects of their wealth accumulation to people who don't have a lot of political power. And often left-leaning people, I don't think like communists tend to say this, but like, you know, squishy socialist type people will say like, we need to internalize those costs. But there's a lot of reasons that's like either not going to happen because of the political aspect, or it's just like literally impossible. So for example, like water pollution, what is the cost of that? Like, if we were to internalize the cost, what is the cost of water pollution? We can't calculate it because it's like very complex and doesn't have like a direct cause and effect relationship to anything. And even if it did, like, being able to prove that is not easy. And then like, what does the number mean? Like, usually externalities are calculated as like lost productivity, but like lost productivity basically treats like corporations as the victims of their own harms.
Yeah.
Because they are the ones that are losing out on the productivity. Or it would be in terms of the amount of money it would take to repair the damage that it caused, which basically assumes that humanity is omnipotent and can like unpollute water by spending enough money or doing enough innovation. So neither of those really work. And I get into like other details on like, even if they did work, there's reasons why like you wouldn't be able to internalize costs. So if you're interested, check the show notes. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yes, I was an environmental studies major for most of college, and I wound up not getting the degree for It's a long story, but I took like basically all of the classes except for like one stats thing. And and I ran into this all the time of people whose solutions, specifically you got this with climate change, was people's solutions was just like, okay, well, let's just like make people pay for, like, you got like carbon credits, or like, okay, so how do we protect this like tree, right? And it's like, oh, we'll just put a price on it.
Yeah.
And it's like, none of them think this through. I mean, it's the classic neoclassical thing where it's like, this is one of the classic problems with libertarianism, which is that anytime you have an unregulated market, the first people who are going to use it is organized crime.
Yeah.
And they never think about this. Like, this is Bitcoin. Like, you saw this, like literally.
Well, crime is illegal, so
Yeah, crime is illegal. You can't do it. Whatever. But the mob is always going to sort of outmaneuver the entrepreneur. But when you get up to the level of sort of carbon taxes, and when you get to the level of sort of like selling off carbon sinks, like, okay, so you're dealing with a much more sophisticated and powerful class of organized criminal, which is the state,
right?
And once you put a monetary value on like a bunch of trees, right? Well, that means that you can directly convert those trees into like Bandar Bush's second yacht, right? And this is a disaster. This is like this is one of the worst things you can possibly do, because it means that if you're thinking about this from a neoclassical perspective, it's like, oh, the indigenous people on the land, now they have like the value of the land and they can free to sell it or collect rent from it. What actually happens, and if you look at the places where people have sold carbon credits, it tends to be places like Brazil, it tends to be places like Myanmar. And in both Brazil and Myanmar, there's a bunch of indigenous people living on this land. And then the army comes in and kills them all and takes the land and then sells it off to like some corporations. Like, oh, it's a carbon credit here. You're offsetting this much carbon. But then, and then they cut the trees down anyways because they're the army and who's going to stop them? Right. And it's like, okay, well, you cannot like, make people pay for externalities because, why are they going to pay you for it? They have guns.
Yes.
And, and this is, and people don't want to look at the fact that giving a monetary value to something, the first thing it does is it makes it able to be stolen.
Right.
And immediately converted into other kinds of goods, which, like the state, like the military dictatorship or ex-organized crime, or just like your corrupt local mayor, like can turn into a yacht.
Yeah. And I mean, like, even without that aspect, like by putting a price on it, you're saying that as long as the benefit that you get out of this harm is like brings in more money than the harm pulls out, then it's fine. So like, if you can cut down a whole forest and turn it into something that is like brings in more revenue than the cost of the externalities of cutting the forest down, then no problem. Like,
10,000 yachts.
That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, but then, you ultimately come to, you can't eat money, you can't drink oil.
Right.
That's the inevitable conclusion of this.
And another thing I didn't think of while I was writing this section is like, it kind of assumed like, if you put a price on trees, does that ever get adjusted? Like, do you just put a price on trees like once and then that's it? Because if so, inflation is always happening. And so like eventually that's not going to be very much money in terms of the rest of the economy.
Wait, but haven't you heard it's impossible, you've seen the models, right? It's impossible for the market to misprice an asset. Value. Yeah. Pay no attention to the 2008 behind the curtain.
I'm forgetting the infinitely many competitors. So
it's great.
But yeah, so the real way to avoid externalities is basically just to like limit power differentials and conflicts of interest that make it appealing or beneficial to do them in the first place. So like, I think this book makes a good case that it's not just the state that you have to get rid of, but like any sort of large bureaucratic organization, because they would all inflict the same sort of plague on humanity of externalities. Okay, so there's one more subsection in this part called short-sightedness, And this is just about how these studies only last like one season, and that there are factions of agricultural science that differ in their view on like short-term versus long-term productivity. But it's just that it's productivity. It's not like, oh, we need to not destroy the ecosystem because if we do, we'll be able to produce less corn. That's what their thing is. All right, so the third to last section is called The Simplifying Practice of Scientific Agriculture. And he's basically talking about how like crops are more than just like the grain kernels that come out of them. So where like agricultural science assumes that your corn yield is equal to like the amount of edible grain that you get out of it. There's actually, believe it or not, a lot of other parts of the plant that can also be useful. And so he gets into like a lot of those other varieties or other parts, and why like different varieties produce like better versions of those parts of the plant that are also useful to indigenous farmers. And he also talks about in Sierra Leone, they say like a rice cooks badly as a shorthand for all these properties that go into like how a rice is produced and processed and cooked. And at some point he gives this example of like a rice variety that is like less predated by birds because they have longer awns, and like the scientists would say like, oh, well, that's bad because you have more mass that isn't the grain kernel, so you're like wasting whatever. Oh, it's in the next subsection, but yeah, the last subsection is just about how like farmers have as much diversity as like the crops on the farm. And we covered a lot of that in the Tanzania episode, so I'll just skip that part. So the second to last section is two agricultural logics compared, and this one I thought was pretty interesting. Although, like I told you in the DM, I was kind of falling asleep by this point. But so Scott brings up the research of a very long-named Dutch guy about Andean farmers who grow potatoes as a staple. And so he basically says they cultivate like over a dozen different plots on a permanent basis and others on a rotating basis. And because they're in the mountains, they have like all these different conditions. And each plot may have anywhere between 1 and 10 different cultivars each. And he's saying that basically like they plant all these seeds as like a well-placed bet on what the conditions of the farm are going to be for this season. And I thought the most interesting part of this was that when he compares it to industrial agriculture, he points out that industrial agriculture is exactly the opposite of that. It produces specific ideal crops in a lab and then tries to force the environment to adapt to the one crop being planted in a massive area. And so industrial agriculture has to have everything going right for it to work at all, and suffers greater losses when any one thing goes wrong.
Yeah, and this is part of the problem with this is when you look at the Andean farmers, right? The Andean farmers, like they're rotating through crops. They're also planting a bunch of different kinds of potatoes at the same time, and that they're able to do this really fine grained differentiation between even like meter by meter, right? Of hey, this soil is this. Has this property, these soils have these properties, there's like a tree stump here, there's stuff there. And they're able to sort of, and you said this, they're able to operate extremely efficiently because, in a way that the sort of lab potato like industrial farmers can't, because they understand the local terrain, they have all this local knowledge. And, well, I guess I can pivot into this, okay, one of David Graeber's things is that whenever someone says that their goal is efficiency, they're lying, and they're saying it because they don't want to tell you what their actual goal is.
Yeah, that's a big bugbear of mine, because efficiency alone is like meaningless. You could have efficiency of anything.
Yeah, it's a means. not an end. Yeah, it could be like your efficiency could be the most efficient way to kill people, right? Like, you don't want this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, someone said something like about capitalism being more efficient like a couple weeks ago, and I was like, efficient at what? Like, what are you talking about specifically?
Yeah, well, it's incredibly efficient at making sure that like Mark Zuckerberg can eat iguanas.
We're not going to survive.
Yeah, you look at global food production, right? Like, we produce enough food to feed 8 billion people. We feed 6 billion people with it, and we've completely destroyed like every ecology that exists in order to do this, in order to again make more food than we need and then not feed people with it. But this is something about sort of industrial agriculture and the sort of high modernist collectivized farms is that, again, it's not about efficiency because they're not efficient, right? They're incredibly inefficient. Even the modern American farming system, again, only functions because they have billions and billions of dollars of agricultural subsidies that no one else gets. But again, they're not really designed. Their goal isn't efficiency. Their goal is social control.
Yeah.
And as engines of social control, they are in fact extremely efficient for the most part. Sometimes it breaks down, but the Soviet collective farms were successful in completely annihilating the Soviet peasantry as a political force. And you got this with Tanzania too, where it's like, yeah, congratulations, you actually did successfully crush the sort of you basically crushed the rural populations as a political force just in time to be overthrown by a military coup.
Right.
It's a good job, guys. This is one of the ways that sort of state socialist projects undermine themselves, because as part of the sort of the way the state works, the way the sort of the logics of states function, simplifying assumptions they have to make, and the way that their policy, is designed to force everyone, a law, right? Like, a law is a small group of people have made a decision and they will now commit violence unless you specifically obey them. Right? This is all completely sort of antithetical to any kind of autonomy, which means that, any kind of autonomous organization, you see this in Latin America all the time, where it's like, okay, so a government will take power based off of revolutionary movements, and then they immediately have to turn around and smash the movement that created them. Because if they don't do this, there's a second power base around that's autonomous. It's not tied to the state. And so they do this, and eventually the state wins basically every time. And then that socialist government gets overthrown by a coup, because if now they've destroyed their own base, there's nothing to stop the right from sort of destroying them. And this logic of sort of state socialism, even if you are a state socialist, is ultimately self-defeating, because you're basically, Marx talks about capitalism is creating its own gravediggers, but the people who created their own gravediggers was socialism,
right?
They created this technical class that eventually sort of transforms into a capitalist class. They in the sort of I don't know, market socialist probably isn't the right word, but in the sort of social democratic Latin American context specifically, one of the big things they do is they create they create a new middle class, and then they get overthrown by that middle class because they're a middle class. They have all the class characteristics of the middle class, and it's great job, guys. You really went and did it.
Yeah, I have a really glib way of putting that, which is anti-capitalism always leads back to capitalism. If you resist capitalism specifically, but not the state in general, then it's just going to lead back to capitalism. You're going to create a state, and then that state's going to become a capitalist state, because capitalism is just rationalized state management. And so the other thing that I say all the time is, if you hate capitalism and not the state, you just hate being rational. Once you start figuring out the most efficient way to run your state, as in the most efficient way to consolidate control and be in control of everything, you're going to eventually come back to capitalism. So yeah, stagism is a plague on humanity. In other words.
Oh God. Well, I mean, I think the only way to rehabilitate stagism is by an understanding that what sort of we could call Soviet communism, you could call sort of existing socialism is just, well, this is why Tanzania, the Tennessee Valley Authority, American projects in Vietnam and the Soviet Union look the same, because they're all development ideologies.
Yeah.
Right. The whole point of them is to build a developmental state.
So so the thing to do with stagism is to invert it and go backwards, which is why Pol Pot is the best socialist.
God, no, not this. I think, but like you have to at some point realize that, like, state socialism was essentially just a phase of capitalist development in countries that couldn't have been, developed otherwise. Like, there's this great Deng Xiaoping line that's, we no longer know what socialism is or how to get there, yet it remains the goal. Perfect encapsulation of this. It's like, wow. Yeah, congratulations, you've successfully built a developmental state. But what you do with a developmental state? Well, the only thing you can actually, developmental states don't develop communism. The only thing they actually develop is just capitalism. And so, really, like, all, like, both feudalism turns into capitalism, or it turns into a developmental state, which also turns into capitalism. And so you have to actually find something else that is the stage beyond capitalism. That's not just like, hey guys, we, like, it's not Stalin saying we're going to do capitalist industrialization in 10 years. Because, hey, guess what? If you do capitalist industrialization, you get capitalism.
I mean, you could even reclaim the developmental rhetoric, where development is like developing a, trying to think of a cool word, but all I can think of is fecund ecosystem, like a really, like, diverse and resilient ecosystem. And that's what you're developing. And, that's kind of the opposite of what the normal development is.
Yeah. Well, I think also, like, if you want to talk about the genuinely damaging stuff about development, is that development posits that there's a linear history and that people are just further behind in time,
right? But
that's not what's happening. There's the somewhat crazed Venezuelan anthropologist Fernando Coronil, who the man who fully expressed the trialectic and then died and never explained it to anyone else.
Trialectic.
Yeah, it's great. No one has any idea how it works. Like, literally no one. It's great. But he had this great phrase that he called it the International Division of Nature and Labor, where he talks about, instead of the people being locked in time, it's that capitalism sort of assigns different, like, there's the capitalist division of labor, but then it also assigns different sort of levels of development based on, or what I call levels of industrialization, mm-hmm. based on sort of resource distribution and, also colonial power, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. That is another incredibly long tangent in this tangent episode.
So, I mean, all that's left really is the conclusion. So if there's any other points that you wanted to bring up, now's a great time for that.
Yeah, I think just in general, people have this real, especially sort of people who call themselves scientific socialists, have this just incredible hostility to indigenous agriculture practices. And this is true.
Oh, that is exactly like the high modernist aesthetic thing that he's talking about all through this book, for sure.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you get to see the different ways this plays out. And this also plays out inside of, this is why he's talking about Nyerere, mm-hmm. and, the way this plays out inside of socialist states. But, like, you get this there's a huge thing in Vietnam where, like, the Vietnamese government just, like, it was like the Highland indigenous people just get absolutely slaughtered by the sort of socialist government. And you see this, like, scientization events in China, and you see this even when you have, like, people who are indigenous in charge of governments in Latin America, you mm-hmm. get these huge battles. Like Bolivia has this, or these massive battles between sort of indigenous people who don't want development versus the sort of, like, the sort of state socialists who are like, no, you're like, we're gonna make this giant highway that goes through your land,
right?
And people have this real, like, even people who call themselves leftists, even people who think they're sort of pro-indigenous, have this real hatred of sort of indigenous practices and indigenous sort of, I guess you could call it science, but it's indigenous sort of agricultural practices and indigenous ways of life. And we're all going to die unless we stop doing the stuff that we're doing. Mm-hmm. Right. Like, this is the thing about developing productive forces. If we develop the productive forces much further, life is not going to survive on Earth. And, you have to be able to get over the stuff Scott is talking about how, like, the sort of agricultural specialist won't learn from indigenous peoples, right? You have to get over that stuff because these people have, and then there's a lot of reasons for this, but one of them is that indigenous people have just an unbelievable amount of sort of agricultural knowledge that like could bail the rest of us out of our mistakes. And, that's in some sense like a terrible burden that, we've put on indigenous people by just massacring them and replacing their forms of social organization, their ways of life with like our shit. But, you're going to have to get over your just like techno-modernist fetishism or whatever and, learn how to crop.
It's funny, even with that specific bit, like them having the cultural genetic plant knowledge to like restore biodiversity. I was looking at this Vice video about the future of farming because I wanted to get mad at it, because the first part was about some Dutch guy who made a big giant hydroponic farm that's like vertical or whatever. People are obsessed with vertical farming for whatever reason, even though it's stupid. The second half was about like a permaculture farm, which was better. But I saw in the comment section like people saying like, "Oh, don't worry about like biodiversity loss because we have the Svalbard seed bank."
Oh God,
which I'm guessing doesn't have the same level of diversity as the like land races that indigenous cultivators are keeping. Just a wild guess.
Yeah, well, also like they're not creating new seeds.
Yeah,
right. And this is one of the things with indigenous cultivation is they're constantly creating slightly different.
And doesn't it depend on like intense climate control? Like that's the reason it's a thing.
Oh yeah. And this is also, I just as a sort of general revolutionary note, like there's lots of moral reasons for this, but like if you're not compelled by the moral reasons, like at least see the sort of scientific necessities of climate change reasons for the fact that any revolution in North America is going to have to, like, maybe, I'm not sure if led by is exactly the right term, but like it's going to have to be an indigenous revolution or it's not going to happen at all and we're all going to die. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was like land back is not like a. Was it you that did the tweet of like there are two tendencies in the modern left, land back and something else, and like throws it like a grenade and runs away? Oh yeah, it was land back and communization. Yeah, basically. The ultra left. Yeah, but like like it's not just like a slogan or tendency. It's like either we do this or like we face the extinction of most of humanity, and we're already just going to lose countries. Yeah, right. Even in the best case scenarios, countries are just going to be lost to the sea. Right. And if we don't want to get any worse, we have to do land back. Like there's no alternative. Yeah, this chapter definitely makes a good case for that, and yeah. I also think it makes a good case against like specialization. Yeah. Like I think specialization is like a very statist thing, like very mega machine thing to do. And if like, a couple billion people had the sort of knowledge of local ecological conditions and this like wealth of plant cultivars, then I don't think we would be in much danger at all. Yeah, well, especially if there weren't people at gunpoint forcing them not to do it. Mm-hmm. Like, and this isn't to say that like it's not, like people screw up. People, even people who have really sophisticated knowledge of the sort of local stuff, like they'll make mistakes. But also like the agriculture that was being done specifically in North America in the like 200 or 300 year period before sort of the Europeans got here was really good. Mm-hmm. And they'd created a system that had a huge amount of biodiversity, that was relatively stable, that didn't involve, obviously they're intentionally maintaining sort of buffalo numbers and stuff like that. But, mm-hmm. Like it was a good system. Right. And we can, obviously like whatever system we're doing isn't going to just be exact repeat of that, but like it is possible, contra sort of primitivist fantasies, like it is actually possible to have human natural relations where we don't literally kill every plant and we kill every animal. Like we can do this, and we have done this before, and we can do it again. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to heap on to like bad stuff, but I think it is important to put that out there that like we're not for sure all doomed, you know?
Yeah.
Things can come back.
Yeah. And, and I think also, as damaging of a blip as it's been, like we have to keep in mind, people think on a time scale, when they think about what was long ago in the past, I think about like Rome. Rome was like 2,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
There's 4,000 years of state history, like before that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's hundreds of thousands of years of history way beyond that, hundreds of thousands. Everything we're seeing right now is this just tiny microscopic blip on the sort of, broad, not even on geological time, broad historical human time.
Uh-huh.
Right. All the sort of violence that we're seeing it's a blip. And, as long as we don't irrevocably damage the planet and irrevocably sort of destroy ourselves, like it can just be a blip that like 100,000 years from now, they're like tales of the bad time when we like
the whoops, we did civilization time.
Yeah. Like this is the thing. This is a future that we could have.
But, we won't have like, PlayStation 5s, so I don't know if it's really worth it. I think I would rather just kill everyone. I'll just say the conclusion part real quick. Scott says high modernist agriculture is associated with unparalleled agricultural productivity in the West, which I wonder if that's actually true. I didn't have time to look it up.
I don't actually buy this, but okay. Unparalleled agricultural productivity / subsidies.
I mean, I guess like in the terms that they measure it, yes, sure.
Yeah.
Just like productivity has its own specific definition here, which, we think of it as like the qualitative, like, oh yeah, being more productive, but they're surely measuring it in specifically like yield per acre or something like that.
Yeah, but I also say that like even sort of capitalists, like if you read the capitalist if you read the Koch's think tank, right? Like even the sort of capitalist think tanks think that American agriculture is extremely inefficient. We shouldn't subsidize it. So
that's a good point. Yeah,
it's unclear to me whether this is actually agricultural productivity or agricultural subsidies.
Right.
So but.
Well, we did grow way more food than the number of people that need to eat. So
it's true.
Yeah. But and we have McDonald's everywhere, so that's cool. So for this reason, agricultural scientists have absolute faith in their version of reality. So like because they see themselves as having done better than any other person in history, essentially, they will just disregard anyone who says like, "Hey, you're stupid," and think that like indigenous cultivators are backwards people stuck in their own ways, whereas they are actually the ones that are backwards and stuck in their own ways.
Yep.
So yeah, that's the last bit of the chapter. Any last minute thoughts before we wrap it up? I think we covered it pretty well. There is one thing you said. I think the point about how if you can make a controlled environment follow the rules exactly, then that gives you incredible degrees of power. I didn't really understand what you meant by that. Oh
yeah, so this was sort of going back to the de-skilling thing.
Mm-hmm.
Which is that okay? So a lot of what de-skilling is that okay? So you have these like the cow is spherical models, right?
Right.
That just that they can't be fit out, and the sort of project of you call it high modernism or sort of capitalist modernity is to make those like cows actually do the thing they're supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And, and part of the way you have to do this is descaling. But if you can create production processes where humans really do act like they're supposed to in the models, and again, you can only do this by converting human labor into machines. But if you can do this gives you unbelievable amounts of political power because
right.
Yeah, because everyone's replaceable. This creates social atomization. This creates sort of you have an environment that you completely and totally control, and that gives you basically unlimited political power and the ability to just do whatever terrible capitalist or even sort of capitalist or socialist, sort of like state or like Soviet socialist things. And yeah, that's incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, true. I was just thinking it's like there's the like 3D printing thing was like, we can make machines that make parts of themselves. But this is the opposite of that. It's a machine that can destroy parts of itself.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that should just about do it. Chris, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Is there anything you would like to plug?
Okay, I have a Twitter account. It's at itbchr3. It's also the Ice Must Be Destroyed dude. I don't know. I am morally questioning whether I should continue to have this Substack, but I have one, and it's called The Long 21st Century, and I occasionally publish things there. Yeah, so that's the extent of my plugging stuff.
Cool. I will link that in the show description along with those books that you mentioned.
Sweet. Thank you.
So thanks everyone for listening. I think there's only 2 more chapters left in the book. I haven't figured out who's going to be on the next one. Well, bye. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our other episodes on every podcast platform, including Spotify and YouTube. We would love it if you left a nice review on iTunes, which helps people get the show in their recommendations, or tell your friends if you're cool enough to have those. We have a low-key merch shop at Teespring with some cool shirt designs. I know it's not really good to use them, but until there's significant interest in merch, it would be pretty impractical to do a run of merch from a proper printer. So if people are interested, let us know. You can follow us on Twitter at NeighborSciPod. If you want to support the show and help pay our producer, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/neighborscience. Our producer for some of our episodes is Casino Socks. You can check out his music at soundcloud.com/Casino Socks. And finally, you can check out our website, neighborsciencepodcast.com, which has tags on all our episodes. So if you're looking for a particular subject, it's much easier to find on there than just scrolling through the entire list of episodes in your podcast app. And thanks again for listening.